I have in my garage a jug of Roundup that I have not finished using, and I just dread using it, and I can't justify spreading it on weeds in the cracks in my driveway and other things. Even though I don't have small children toddling about or pets that run around outside, I'm just have become wary of this product by a great name in the American chemical industry, Monsanto. And Roundup has in it glyphosate as the active ingredient. But as Sharon Lerner, an Intercept journalist, a writer at the Intercept media platform, which is a nonprofit investigative journalism platform, she indicates that there are questions about what are called the inert or inactive ingredients in that product, which may be even more toxic. And yet, as she explains in her work at Intercept.com, that the notice of these dangers is being overlooked. Sharon, thanks for joining us. You are in Baltimore and are a reporter at the Intercept, which is a very diverse platform that investigates all kinds of hot topics. What is it about these? What's the main? I guess just backing up for a second. What's the main danger of Roundup? Why should people like me and why should we be hesitating to use it if we have it or to buy it?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. And I'm in New York, actually not in Baltimore, but thanks for having me. And I have over the years written about Roundup, the Monsanto product, and as you know, it's the most widely used herbicide in the world, so it's a very big product. And there have been questions about the safety of it for several years. In 2015, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is known as IARC, declared glyphosate, which is, as you mentioned, the active ingredient in Roundup, a probable human carcinogen. And that caused a lot of debate around the world, really, about the product. And after that announcement came in 2015, there's a big class action suit in the United States was filed on behalf of people who have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a form of cancer, and believe that they got it as a result of being exposed to Roundup. So that litigation, which is still moving forward, has brought up a lot of questions and a lot of issues. One of the questions that has arisen through this, though it has been raised well before this litigation, is over the safety of these quote-unquote inert ingredients. So inert suggests, when you call something inert, that it doesn't have any effect on anything. But in fact, inert technically means, when you talk about chemical products, it means that just means it's not the declared active ingredient. And in Roundup, there are several quote unquote inert ingredients, and this has come up in that lawsuit that I mentioned, the class action lawsuit, and which is what I wrote about actually more than a year ago, writing about this. But basically, the lawyers in this suit, who are again representing people who have cancer after being exposed to, a lot of them are actually agricultural workers or people who work in gardens and use the product a lot. But anyway, through research, and the lawyers were picking out various studies, which are pretty recent, some from 2014, some from 2015, that show that one particular quote-unquote inert ingredient, one thing that goes into has gone into Roundup called POEA, is particularly toxic. And what I kind of tried to unpack in my story is how anybody even figures this out, because one of the problems in figuring out what inert ingredients do is figuring out what they in fact are, because companies aren't required to list all their ingredients. So for the scientists who are trying to figure out when things are safe, it's virtually impossible for them to piece out the actual chemicals that are in a product, because if a company has to say, for instance, for Monsanto, they have to say glyphosate is our active ingredient. They don't have to say what their inert ingredients are. So I kind of followed a couple of scientists who actually used this process called mass spectrometry to analyze what is in the rest of Roundup. And one of the things they found, again, in many of the products, because there are different formulations sold under different names, but one of them is, or has been, I don't know if it's still in all the formulations, is POEA. And when these scientists actually took a look, tested the effects of POEA, they found it to be toxic, and in some cases more toxic than glyphosate, which again was, has had lots of questions about carcinogenicity and other health effects.
Well, you say in your story that POEA is between 1,200 and 2,000 times more toxic to cells than glyphosate, the active ingredient.
Yeah, and it's also important to say that there are also real questions about glyphosate, but I think this particular piece of it just kind of shows you how complicated it is to show the safety of, prove the safety of chemicals and prove the dangers of chemicals too. Because, and part of it, again, is figuring out what they are. And the reason, again, is that they're not required to identify them all. And this, frankly, has been an issue, sort of industry secrecy around the ingredients and research on the ingredients since the beginning of the marketing of Roundup and glyphosate. So, and you, I think, have seen another piece I did much more recently about a trove of industry documents that includes which was released 2 weeks ago. It's called the Poison Papers, and people can find it if they want to search on that at poisonpapers.org. And basically, it's lots and lots of different documents from Monsanto and other companies that were released through legal discovery and lawsuits over the toxicity of herbicides and pesticides. And in this particular bunch of documents, there's a lot of interesting information that's been available to very few people over the years, but it's been out there a little bit, which shows that that the labs that initially declared glyphosate as safe to market, and this lab was called IBT, was actually corrupt, and people ended up going to jail because of it. But basically, they ended up using fraudulent data to initially approve glyphosate and many other products through this lab. And if anyone wants to go down the rabbit hole with that, it sounds like a very inflammatory statement, but you can actually go to poisonpapers.org and search for IBT labs, and you'll get hundreds of documents that detail the history of this lab, which wasn't the only one, by the way, which basically in the beginning of the EPA was used to justify the continued marketing and use of various products that had entered the market before the EPA was required to test or look at all at chemical safety.
This is David Tulis, and we're talking with Sharon Lerner. She's a reporter for The Intercept, which is an investigative media platform with several stories. If you go to Intercept, just do a find on her name, and you'll find the article about the Poison Papers, her most recent one that caught my eye. I'm a subscriber to The Intercept and get the weekly digest, and there it was just recently. Well, Sharon, say a little bit about the discovery or the putting online of these 100,000 pages of documents that were given over by by the chemical industry and the government in litigation. They were in an old barn, and the woman who began to keep them and began to organize them in paper form has really a remarkable story about how she became involved in, you might say, the fight for the environment, or conversely, perhaps the fight against big corporate chemical players.
Yeah, so you're talking about Carol Van Strum, and she does have a really crazy story. She moved to the National Forest in Oregon, the Siuslaw Forest, in the 1970s with her family, and was looking for a simple life. You know, they had bought a very old house there and were just going to raise their own food. And shortly after she moved there, her children were sprayed by a National Forest Service vehicle with what turned out to be an herbicide called 2,4,5-T, and it sickened them, made them sick. And it turned out, she learned from meeting with other members of her community that other people had been sprayed, some from helicopters, and there were a lot of reports of animals that who had gotten sick, and a lot of people got sick. And the locals began pushing to get the National Forest Service to stop spraying with these chemicals, which it turned out were the two of them, there's 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, were actually the active ingredients in Agent Orange, which I'm sure, as your listeners know, was used in Vietnam also as an herbicide, and in the 70s, and it was 60s and 70s, I believe. But anyway, its use was stopped because of health concerns and concerns for the environment. It made people sick, and it made animals sick. And yet, even after that happened in Vietnam, it was being used by the National Forest Service. And it really took years of fighting on behalf of Carol Van Strum and others in her area to get the National Forest Service to stop. It was very, it was a legal battle. It was other kinds of battle too. They really, protested, and there was a lot of anger in her community. And so, she ended up helping with the litigation, getting sort of a low-cost lawyer who, in exchange for a reduced fee, was asking her to do some of the research. So she ended up doing a lot of the research and keeping the documents in her barn. Over the years, she got hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that came through legal in that case, but in others too, because she ended up sort of helping other people who were fighting the same fight in other national forests around the country, and who were working on related issues, legal suits around the country. So she kind of became this repository for legal documents about herbicides and other pesticides and other issues pertaining to chemicals. So she's an amazing person. It's also, been a sort of point of interest in that story. I mentioned that her 4 children she had between 5 and 13 died in a fire that that she suspects, was that perhaps was some an act of arson by people who were on the other side of this issue from her. It's never been proven, and it's one of these, it's one of these things that's impossible probably to prove at this point. But her personal story ends up being tragic and interesting, I think.
Now, the trademark on Monsanto's glyphosate is off, and other manufacturers produce like weed killers, like they're called desiccants, to Monsanto. Is glyphosate common in the food supply, Sharon Lerner? Is it something that we all have in our bodies because we eat food protected
there's
by
been a lot of
Roundup?
news reports about this recently. Even Ben and Jerry's, like what was it? Had samples, most of the samples of Ben and Jerry's tested positive for it. Virtually everything that doesn't, if you use corn syrup that's not organic, and it's virtually trace amounts of it will be in food. Very common.
And what is the effect on my listener and his children, do you suppose?
Well, I mean, I think that's the question. I don't think I can answer that definitively, but I think, this debate, which is again happening across the world, in Europe and here and in the courts. I mean, it has to do with, it has to do with what we can trust in terms of the evidence of its safety and evidence of its harms. And I think that it's very safe to say there are a lot of big questions, both that are coming up every day these days. And over the past 2 weeks, there's been lots of news coming out from the ongoing suits that show that Monsanto executives were working really hard to control what evidence became public about the health, the effects of their chemical on health, both in terms of laboratory studies and in terms of effects on people. And I think that this, obviously this battle it's a big one. It's a legal one. It's also a regulatory issue in many countries, and some countries have already banned the inert ingredients. Some countries have banned glyphosate. So I think there are enough questions. So again, I can't definitively say if your child eats this, X will happen. I don't think anyone can definitively say that. I think there are questions about its overall safety, and those are both about its safety and what we've known about it and who controls what we know about it.
Let me ask you
Let
me ask you a last question. This is David Tulis, and we're talking with Sharon Lerner, who is a reporter for the Intercept. The Intercept, the general tenor of stories there is, you might say, pro-regulation. It's very critical of Trump and the fact that he's having pro-business people take positions in the EPA is presented as greatly alarming. On the other hand, could we not say that because we have centralized regulation of industry, there is at the top of the industrial pyramid and the state pyramid a kind of collusion and agreement on how each big government and big business support each other? Is there maybe not some argument in favor of deregulation and returning to the states, perhaps, regulation of dangerous chemicals and not leaving it in the hands of Washington? The EPA seems on many fronts to be corrupt and inefficient. What's your take personally, Sharon Lerner, on that question? Or do we need a strong EPA, and is Trump wrong to diminish it?
Yes, I think of course we need a strong EPA, and states are almost never prevented from issuing stronger regulations than the federal one. States are not prohibited by strong federal regulations. They can make their levels and limits in most always stronger. So it's not, and it doesn't make sense that if you had a strong EPA that makes the states weak. I mean, I think that what you're really looking at is the inability of both the state and federal governments to counter the enormous pressure that's exerted by, in this case, the chemical industry, it's really tremendous. And when you look at, efforts to pass TSCA, the recent Toxic Chemical Reform Act, I mean, there are just millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars spent to make sure that these laws don't limit the profits of chemical industry, of chemical companies. And while, that under our system, that's how we operate, they're allowed to express themselves this way, which means, really pay for their opinions to influence legislation. We really don't have anything near an equal counterpush that represents the interests of people, just regular people like you and me and your listeners who are exposed to these things.
But we do we do have the courts, though, and and you have covered court action against these companies.
And I do write about that, and and there is again this really quite a lot of litigation about this going on, but that's really only one piece of it, and the laws matter, and also, what is what we are able to know and learn matters. So that's why what comes out through these cases is so important.
Well, Sharon Lerner of The Intercept, thank you so much for joining my listener and me here at Nooganomics and News Radio. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, have a good one. Bye.
Sharon Lerner is a reporter at The Intercept. You can find her work at intercept.com. And we've been hearing about Monsanto and glyphosate and the efforts by the industry to shield and hide very dangerous elements in Roundup and desiccants, weed-killing chemicals that are readily available here in Hickson, in Ooltewah, and downtown, and retail outlets all through Chattanooga. David Tulis, Nooga Radio.
The Tennessee Valley's news, talk, and sports leader, Nooga Radio, AM 12.